The Israeli Special Forces operators moved under a storm of heavy projectiles. Their target was the captivity site, where their intelligence agents had reported that 3 hostages were being held. They were under the threat of Hamas explosions, and their mission could have been interrupted by a sudden death inside Gaza. These men were part of the same highly specialized troop that, during the night, placed explosives in front of the Hamas hostages' captivity site and detonated them, then began a fight to storm the location in an attempt to free the people kidnapped during the terrorist attack on October 7, 2023. It would be arduous months of combat in which Israeli special forces would hunt down every soul that caused terror on their soil. The role of Israeli special forces in the history of their country is one of the foundations of its existence. For more than 70 years, even before their armed forces were fully organized, these troops were already in action, developing strategies that allowed a much smaller state to fight better organized forces in the various conflicts they were involved in. It's impressive how the country managed to prepare itself so early. The origin of the modern concept of special forces is in World War II. Specific combat groups existed centuries before, but not with the idealization that began in the mid-20th century. This is an impressive fact because when David Stirling was creating the British Special Air Service in 1941, considered the first modern special force, Ariel Sharon was 13 years old. A year later, Stirling and his men were causing chaos in the fight against the Nazis in Africa. Meanwhile, Sharon was joining the Gadna, a paramilitary force made up of young people. Later, he joined the Haganah, a clandestine Jewish paramilitary organization that fought against the British administration in Palestine. At the age of 20, Sharon was a brigade leader, and 5 years later, in 1953, he founded and led Unit 101, the first special forces unit of the Israel Defense Forces, From there, many groups emerged, such as the 4 elite units formed by Seyeret Matkal, Shayetet 13, Chaldag, and Unit 669. Commando groups like Duvdevan, Maglan, and Egos would have their specific tasks, fighting in the region against enemies such as Hezbollah and Hamas. Units like Al-Qaeda with their loyal combat dogs and Yahalon with their engineers would be equally important, finding the enemies in their tunnels and then destroying them. In addition, there were groups like Yaman, which was under the border police and specialized in counter-terrorism activities. Most of these groups respond to various situations and often rely on intelligence provided by the agencies they work with, such as Mossad, Shin Bet, or Yaman. That's why they only responded late to the attack on October 7, 2023. The failures of the security agencies in using their information allowed Hamas to enter Israel, carrying out the Al-Aqsa flood operation with mastery and terror, with the tacit goal of killing and kidnapping their neighbors. The attack was ruthless and lasted for hours until finally the Israel Defense Forces responded, often using their special forces. Among the famous scenes of this horror was the kidnapping of Noah Argamani during the music festival, where more than 200 people were killed and many others were kidnapped. It was also impossible to forget the massacre at the kibbutzim, like when the Nuzerat Battalion, one of Hamas's troops, killed civilians without facing any resistance. Just in the Be'eri kibbutz, the Nuzerat Battalion killed more than 100 people and kidnapped about 20 under the command of men like Ahmed Wahaba and Ismail Siraj. The Israeli troops fought hard to drive terror out of their territory. Many of the Hamas men were arrested and many others were killed. After counting the victims of the horror and wiping away the tears, the armed forces planned a response that would include many special operations inside Gaza. The first step was to enter the Gaza Strip, then to spread their secret agents and gather information about the hostages. The special forces would have dangerous missions during this conflict. Shayetet 13 supported the Yemen Special Forces in an essential mission for Israel inside the Gaza Strip. Chimbete alerted about the location of hostages. The Yemen unit was responsible for the direct assault with the support of Shayetet 13 for transportation in case the operation succeeded. Unfortunately, attacking Hamas bases and rescuing hostages was a difficult task that could often end in tragedy. The operation required Yemen soldiers to move through narrow corridors inside Gaza, communicating carefully to maintain the element of surprise. When they approached the captivity site, they planted explosives on the door of the residence where 3 Hamas men were holding 2 hostages. The explosives were detonated as soon as the soldier returned to the squad at the corner and were followed by gunfire to break through enemy defenses. The silence of the rifles was consumed by the blasts of explosives. The rifles resumed their nighttime song soon after. As they approached, the men threw grenades. Gunfire and explosions took over the night and the souls of the Hamas men. Alert, the soldiers shot at the enemies who appeared in the surrounding windows. The entry was tense. A single man could cause damage. There are so many trained soldiers squeezed together on a staircase. The battle left the hostages apprehensive until they realized that the Israelis had finally entered the captivity. Then they had to run to get out of there with the hostages still alive. Hamas tried to stop the rescue group by firing from the buildings. A sniper's shot filled the window from where the attack was coming with fire. The impact of the anti-tank missile was followed by rifle and machine gun fire, which gave space for the rescue to proceed. The hostages were placed in armored transport vehicles and taken to Shayetet 13. The soldiers received Fernando Simon Marman and Norbertos Luis Rar with happiness, as it was one of the first successful rescue missions. They were safely taken by helicopter to a hospital for examinations. They seemed to be in good health. Yemen would be essential in several actions in the fight against radical Palestinian combat groups, not only inside Gaza but also in the West Bank. The Nuseirat refugee camp is located in the central region of the Gaza Strip with a population of over 30,000 people. Contrary to what the name might suggest, it is not a camp made up of tents, as is the case in other parts of Gaza or in so many other areas created because of wars. The area was established after the War of 1948 and has taken on new forms since then. After the start of the conflict between Hamas and the Israel Defense Forces in 2023, the site was bombed repeatedly in the search for Hamas operatives, which also resulted in the deaths of many civilians. In the midst of this search, Shin Bet was looking for clues about the leaders of Hamas and also about the hostages kidnapped on October 7th. The intelligence agency obtained information about 2 of the leaders, Ahmed Wahaba and Ismail Siraj, who had participated in the massacre in Beirut and led Hamas's defenses with the Nuseirat battalion. As soon as Shin Bet gave the green light, the airstrike ended the careers of both men in January 2024. The way was cleared for the Israel Defense Forces to begin its operations in the camp around January 15th. The fighting was not easy. Hamas was not an enemy to be underestimated. With their tunnels and surprise attacks, they caused several casualties among the Israelis. The fighting in Nuseirat was no different from other regions with constant ambushes. Their snipers were always alert, firing heavy projectiles at the exposed and tired soldiers. The Yahalon Engineering Combat Unit, part of the Israeli Special Forces Corps, managed to find Hamas tunnels under one of Gaza's main highways, passing through the Nuseirat camp. After investigating and searching for hostages, the structure was destroyed by Yahalon. Shortly afterwards, they found one of Hamas's rocket production centers in another tunnel. The structure was large and well built. A site was investigated where workshops, chemical and explosives factories, and storage areas for long-range rockets were discovered. Another site that was destroyed by the engineer soldiers of Yahalon. The bombings became part of daily life in Nuseirat. Civilians felt the impact of the bombs, taking their own lives or those of their relatives. Meanwhile, Hamas hid among the houses and in their tunnels, often taking the hostages with them as the Israel Defense Forces approached. Shin Bet tried to track this movement, but his sense of smell often lost the scent of Hamas mixing among the apartments, small corridors, and civilians in Nuseirat. Some of them were identified by drones and executed by aerial fire. Rocket launch sites were targeted by bombs dropped by planes, destroying more of Hamas's support areas. The explosions continued in the following months, eliminating any place where Hamas was identified, but also creating a zone of destruction and a void inside Gaza. At a certain point, journalists ended up being victims of the attack, ending up seriously injured when the bombs exploded over them. Gaza citizens rushed to the victims, trying to take one of the journalists to be treated by doctors. The Palestinian journalist Sam Esharada lost his leg due to the extensive damage caused by the bombing. And more Israeli soldiers also perished amid so much fire. Hamas's RPGs were always active. No matter how many of them were found, there were always others to fire death at the tanks. By April, the Israel Defense Forces had already advanced so far in Nuseirat that they discovered several tunnels and continued the process of destruction. Their soldiers searched every building looking for traces of Hamas or the hostages. When they were under the aim of Hamas core forces, the drone launched its projectile to take out the man and his anti-tank missile. Oxenbeth was alert and hunting. When he heard about Adiu Mansour Kashlan wandering around Nuseirat, he sent a drone to hunt him down and eliminate him. Kashlan was involved in planning terrorist attacks in Israel and the West Bank, but those were his last moments. The operations continued when Oxenbeth received information about 4 hostages in Nuseirat on May 12, 2024. They still didn't know the identities, but there were at least 1 woman and 3 men. The woman had been kept in a separate apartment. None of them saw sunlight or went outside except for her, who once went out wearing a veil over her head and covering her face. For her part, she was forced to prepare food that she could not eat and feed her captors, while the psychological and physical torture continued. The men were beaten repeatedly. After the woman was moved to 4 different apartments, the Chimbedo managed to find her exact location. That was Noah Argamani, the young woman whose image during the kidnapping and her pleas for help were broadcast all over the world. The Israeli agents entered Nuseirat in disguise. For 19 days, men and women walked under the guise of Gaza refugees, searching for more information and checking what was obtained from the interrogation of recently captured Hamas men. A house was rented and the agents blended in with the population. In a short time, it was learned that some of the hostages were in the house of Dr. Ahmed Al-Jamal. His son Abdallah was a freelance journalist who even wrote for Al Jazeera and other newspapers. The location of the hideout in a densely populated area was already difficult. The fact that Hamas men dressed as civilians and mingled with the population made the operation even more difficult, almost making it impossible to know how many were helping. There were weeks of preparation during which the counter-terrorism unit Yemen got ready. Chief Inspector Arnon Zimora was experienced in this kind of operation and recognized how difficult it would be to enter Gaza, take over 2 separate hostage locations, and still get out of there with the hostages alive and safe. His teams trained together using simulations based on what Shin Bet agents had mapped out. On June 6, they entered Luzera in broad daylight. The captivity sites were 200 meters apart from each other. 2 teams were separated. One of them was made up of agents Yaman and Shin Bet. They arrived in civilian clothes and quickly stormed the apartment where Noah Argamana was. The first shots took down the Hamas militants who posed the greatest threat. Quickly, Noah was already in the hands of the Special Forces operators. The signal was given to get out of there right away to the sound of so many gunshots. In 6 minutes, Noah was already on the run with the Israeli soldiers. Inside the vehicle, very scared, she was calmed down by the operators. They took her safely to the rescue helicopter. Only there did her heart begin to find comfort, realizing she was in good hands and feeling the sunlight directly on her skin after so long. The UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter left Gaza to finally take her to reunite with her family. The group responsible for the other 3 hostages did not have the same ease. The soldiers led by Arnon Zimora quickly encountered resistance. The race to reach the hostages was made to the sound of Hamas gunfire while the Yemen rifles tried to clear the way. They burst open the door, allowing entry into the apartment of the Palestinian doctor and his journalist son. The first shots were fatal for the 2 men and the wife who stood in the way of the Israelis. There was no time to think twice in a confined space with an uncertain number of enemies. They had to reach the hostages. The 3 kidnapped people were found in a panic, shouting that they were not Hamas men. Zimora and his men found themselves surrounded under direct fire from Hamas, including RPGs. Trapped inside the apartment, they felt the shots passing through the windows trying to hit them. They had to activate another protocol to continue the rescue. Arnon called for support over the radio. The Israeli paratroopers sprang into action, leaving their armored vehicles and starting to run through Luzera to reach Yemen's position. They had to be quick to provide cover so the hostages could get out safely and also keep the operators alive. They broke down doors to move up to better positions. It was a tense moment. They had to enter places where just one well-positioned man could block all their plans. But they put their rifles in the windows and started shooting at Hamas. Enemies were riddled by the 556 projectiles. Time went by. Hanan finally managed to get enough space to go down the stairs to take the hostages to the rescue vehicle. The rifles burst their ammunition all around, making the rescued men run with their heads down and distressed. The shooting went on for a long time, with the Israelis relying on external support to break through the barrier imposed by Hamas. They tried to advance carefully, but the opponents were everywhere. They were being watched, and enemy weapons were aiming voraciously. Arnon and his men were spotted during the advance. The rocket-propelled grenade locked onto them, and the anxious finger of the Palestinian enemy pulled the trigger, launching an explosive at the soldiers. The explosion expanded in front of the squad, hitting Arnon almost directly. The chief inspector fell to the ground, covered in blood and fragments. Hamas fire continued, but Arnon was carried by his colleagues until they reached the rescue truck. The civilian vehicle began to make its way. The support of the armored vehicles was mandatory. Despite the support of armored vehicles, it ended up stuck amidst intense conflict. Hamas's RPGs flew through Nuseirat several more times, hitting the vehicles. The rescue could fail at any moment. Even the support from the Israeli brigades didn't clear enough of a path for the convoy. The imminent danger protocol was activated. Missiles and bombs started to be fired, raising the smoke of maddened death. The bombs sowed destruction everywhere, exploding just a few dozen meters from the Israelis. Hamas felt the impact of the fire coming from the skies. The path opened up in the middle of the smoke. Finally, the convoy moved on until they reached the area for the extraction of the hostages. The three men, Shomiziv, Almod Meijan, and Andrei Kozlov, were placed inside the helicopter after being held captive for almost a year. The aircraft took off to safely take them to Israel once again, relieved to leave the place where they had been held and tortured. The paratroopers received the signal that everything was fine and began to leave their posts. They evacuated to celebrate a successful rescue, one of the few that the Israelis managed to carry out up until July of 2024. In the midst of this happiness, the family of Yaron Zimora received the news of his death in service to his country. The rescued men were welcomed with a celebration in Israel. Both they and Noah seemed to be fine, but showed signs of malnutrition. The doctors said that the three men showed signs of violence. They reported various forms of torture, some imaginative, such as being kept for hours under blankets in extreme heat. The hospital reported that they suffered severe and muscular atrophy due to malnutrition. But if their terror ended there for so many families in Gaza, it did not. The bombs dropped by the Israelis caused mass destruction in Nuseirat. Lives were torn apart by fire and became fragments of flesh scattered around. The Gaza Ministry of Health reported 274 dead and more than 700 injured during the operation. According to the Israelis, in fact, most of the dead were Hamas operatives and numbered no more than 100. Obviously, the fact that the Gaza Ministry is under Hamas influence and also that the hostages were in the house of a doctor and a journalist cast doubt on the reported number of deaths. But it's very difficult to believe that there wasn't a high number of civilians killed and injured in the process after fighting in such a densely populated area. The Israelis also questioned the fact that Hamas chose to place hostages in an area with so many people they themselves claim to want to protect, and even put families in charge of keeping the captives. Besides the fact that even prominent figures in Gaza, like the Dr. Ahmed Al-Jamal, agreed. That was the fate of a conflict as complex as the one taking place in Gaza, where a population gripped by despair and hunger, surrounded by the fire of war, often found itself caught in the middle of difficult choices in the face of a group like Hamas and the advance of the Israel Defense Forces. Among them, there were those who hated Hamas and tried to survive. Many, driven by fear or in search of protection, chose a side. Others, poisoned by propaganda and hatred, became soldiers in civilian clothes, writing their reports or issuing their medical statements while keeping hostages at home. And there were still those who were just one step away from leaning to either side. All it took was a bomb or a gunshot to steal a loved one from them.